Hey everyone, Milton here, back with another video on Blades of Khaine, and we are nearly through all of the rules. Today we're going to talk about ploys, the firefight and then the strategic ploys, and because the decision making on especially which strategic ploys you need starts to get into how you really play the team, how you need to position, we're going to talk a bit more about a couple of broad strategies of how to play the team, and this is really where we start to put the pieces together. So thank you for bearing with me through a lot of discussion of the rules of the team. Let's start getting to the really fun part. Now, I'd like to start with the Firefight ploys because they're a bit simpler to discuss. For those of you that are new to Kill Team, Firefight ploys are ploys that you spend command points to use during the firefight phase of a turning point, and they generally have an effect that lasts through a single activation or action. Each team has access to 4. So, the first firefight ploy for Blades of Khaine is Blade Wind. I'll go ahead and put the image up on the screen. Blade Wind. Use this firefight ploy during a friendly Blades of Khaine operative's activation. During that activation, that operative can perform 2 fight actions. This is really straightforward. Our Exarchs can all fight twice during their activation, but our warrior models will need to use this ploy if they want to do a second fight action. Now, you do have to spend the APL to fight a second time, so most of the time that'll mean doing a charge and then one fight and then a second fight if you charge multiple targets. And in most games you won't use this very often, but sometimes your opponent has to cluster like a group of gunners together in a small area, and you can get a juicy charge into both and fight them. Or some teams have abilities that end combat and prevent a model from dying, like Felgor Ravager's Frenzying or the Hernkin Jaeger's Leader's special rule. So in those cases, you can charge them, fight, that first fight action ends and they're not actually dead, and then you can do the second one, hit them once, and finish them off. So Blade Wind is very useful, and it can be relevant, especially later in the game, to make sure that you're keeping track of how many command points you're spending, so that you've got that extra one in the bank, so that you can use Blade Wind or Starfall. And that leads us naturally into Starfall, which is the second firefight ploy. Use this firefight ploy during a friendly Blades of Khaine operative's activation. During that activation, that operative can perform 2 shoot actions. Now this is just like Blade Wind, except it's for shooting instead of combat. But Blade Wind is often situational, just because there are likely to only be so many operatives within charge range and close enough to each other to do multiple fight actions. And you'll likely take return damage in melee, making a second fight action fairly risky. Shooting, however, is usually safer, and it's a lot easier to line up multiple shots with a single model. I often end up using this once or twice over the course of a game, usually with a Dire Avenger, just to try and push as much damage as possible before I start committing models to melee. But there are 2 important things to keep in mind. First, your melee operatives all have pistols that are just as good as a shuriken catapult. They don't get access to the Dire Avenger's technique to get lethal 5 up, but it's still a ceaseless rending 3-4 weapon. Second, Blades of Khaine is one of the only teams in the game that can use their ability to double shoot to potentially throw multiple grenades. It's not always going to be worth it, because several of the Marine teams can ignore Piercing 1, although that's just changed recently, so it's a little bit better. And if you look at the math on it, crack grenades don't actually do all that much more than more than you get with just going with a shuriken and trying to get those rending crits. But it's something worth considering. I think more beneficial is on Into the Dark, being able to double shoot and throw 2 frag grenades into horde teams and potentially get ceaseless on it, which we'll discuss in a minute, is really powerful and can create some just kind of blowout win scenarios for you. So, something to keep in mind, we can use Starfall with grenades. So let's see. Up next is Fading Light. Use this firefight ploy during a friendly Blades of Khaine operative's activation. During that activation, that operative can perform the fallback action for 1 less AP. Sometimes you'll need to fall back because you're too badly wounded to fight and you still need 2 APL to do stuff with. And If you're in that scenario, this ploy is exactly what you need. But to be honest, I've played an absurd number of games with Blades of Khaine, and I don't think I've ever ended up using Fading Light. Maybe once or twice. Keep in mind that you have it, but this is the one kind of questionable Firefight ploy that we have access to, where the other three are really, really good. And if you're in a situation where you need to fall back, my initial thought would be to consider trying to use one of the strategy ploys, Dance of Death, instead, to swap out who's actually in melee. If it's a Howling Banshee that's stuck in melee, you can oftentimes just fight and resolve a crit with Rain of Tears to get out of melee, and then still have 2 APL and you've dealt some damage. So this isn't something that I end up using very often. The final Firefight ploy available to Blades of Khaine is Contempt. Use this Firefight ploy when a friendly Blades of Khaine operative is retaliating or an enemy operative is shooting it, after your opponent rolls their attack dice but before rerolls. Until the end of the sequence, your opponent cannot reroll their attack dice. If your opponent declared the use of any Firefight ploys during that sequence that would allow them to reroll, that ploy is cancelled and the command point spent on it is refunded. Contempt is amazing. And it's terrible. Elves are relatively squishy, and most of the time, if you get attacked, you will probably die. But sometimes you have to hang a model in order to score some points. Or through clever use of smoke grenades, Rain of Tears, or Strike and Fade, your opponent will only have one model that can attack your most important piece. All it takes is for them to roll a bit below average, and then you can use Contempt to shut down their ability to reroll and lock them into bad dice that you can actually survive. But as good as it can be for shooting, it's even better if enemies have to charge you in a fight. Because if you stick them with a bad die roll in melee, if they charge you with a Space Marine Legionary and they roll their 5 dice and they only get 1, maybe 2 hits, if you have more successes, then you can parry them out and potentially kill them when retaliating, killing the enemy model during its own activation. That can be a huge swing in the momentum of the game. Now, this ploy is entirely dependent on your opponent's dice. We've all played in one of those games where our opponent never misses an attack, and when that happens, Contempt literally does nothing. But I try to keep a command point up for this ploy basically at all times, just in case a golden opportunity presents itself, because it can definitely win you games. It's also worth noting that any other defensive abilities that you can kind of stack together make it more likely that Contempt can be relevant and save one of your models where it really matters. So things like the Rune of Shielding, which we'll discuss in the next video on equipment, Cover, Smoke, Obscuring, the Unstinting Immovable technique for Dire Avengers, the Shriek That Steals technique for Howling Banshees, or the Forewarned strategic ploy, can all combine to make it more likely that you can get just enough saves to survive something really important when you need to most. So it's important. I know there's a lot of different rules on this team, but it's important to keep in mind which ones you have access to, because that can change the math on whether or not it's worth it to use Contempt just to stop 1 or 2 rerolls and guarantee that one of your pieces survives. So those are the 4 Firefight ploys, and they're fairly straightforward. 3 of the 4 really good, the 4th one quite situational. But now let's talk about the strategy ploys or strategic ploys. Strategic ploys are used during the strategic phase of the turn, and they tend to have an effect that works on your whole team for the duration of the turning point, or that gives you some sort of out-of-phase movement or effect that happens during the strategic phase. Where Firefight ploys are abilities that tend to have a singular effect and then go away, these tend to be lasting buffs that can change how a team operates. Now, I'm going to read through all 4 of them, and we're going to talk about some deeper strategy since they change how the team operates, and this is where you really start to get into individual play styles and how the decisions that you make in the strategic phase influence the whole of the turning point. The first strategic ploy is Forewarned. Whenever an operative is shooting a ready, friendly Blades of Khaine operative, you can reroll any of your defense dice results of one result, e.g. results of 2. This is basically ceaseless for your defensive rolls against shooting for your ready operatives, but it does specify that you only get these defensive rerolls on your ready operatives, so I rarely end up using this, because ideally, I'm not hanging very many ready operatives where my opponent can easily shoot at them at the start of a turning point. And if I do have to hang multiple operatives, usually those are going to be the first things that I'm going to activate when I get to go during a turning point, so I just won't get very many opportunities to use those Forewarned rerolls, even if I have staged things close to the enemy. So I'll generally only use this if I've screwed up, if I've accidentally positioned things where they can get shot, and I don't realize it until too late, or in the late game if I really need one particular operative to survive a round of shooting before it can activate. It'll happen sometimes, especially if you and your opponent are each down to 1 or 2 models on the table, and it's that sort of scrappy turning point for where they've got a shot to kill you before you can go. But the best way to survive an enemy ranged model's activation is not to get shot at all. And as an APL3 team with extra movement tools, Blades of Khaine is better equipped to just not get shot than most teams in the game. So, Forewarned, I tend to think of as a last resort if I've really made a mistake, or if it's the only thing that can potentially win me the game in a tight situation, but I don't use it very often at all. The second strategic ploy is Ruthless Poise. Whenever a friendly Blades of Khaine operative is fighting a ready enemy operative, that friendly operative's melee weapons have the ceaseless weapon rule. So this seems like a really strong ploy at first, right? We have pretty good melee, and so if a thing gives us ceaseless on our melee, that seems quite nice. But I hardly ever use it, and from discussing the team with some other folks online that have seen some success, I'm not alone here. And the reason is that there's 2 big caveats on this. First, whenever a friendly Blades of Khaine operative is fighting, so you have to be the active operative, retaliating, you don't get the rerolls. And that's a huge difference. There are several teams like Plague Marines on their Lumbering Advance ploy, where they get ceaseless excuse me, when they're fighting if they haven't moved over a certain amount, or when they're retaliating, and so that's really good in melee matchups. Ruthless Poise, that doesn't work. And secondly, you only get the rerolls against ready enemy operatives, so operatives that have not yet activated. And basically this is where we have to start diving into broader strategy for the team. Ceaseless on melee attacks is great, and since our Striking Scorpions and Howling Banshee models only have 4 attacks hitting on 3s, sometimes they just whiff. Or if you're able to get an attack through, but your opponent can parry you out and survive a fight action, you're not going to be getting the kills you need when you need them. So the problem is that because we only get the ceaseless against ready enemy operatives, in most games your opponent won't have that many ready operatives within charge range of your models. If they do, that will often mean they're a horde team where you already kill them with only 2 successful hits anyways, or you've also exposed a lot of your models to return fire from those ready enemy operatives if they activate first. And because Kill Team is an alternating activation game, you're hanging a lot of material, and we can't afford to just lose models easily. We can't. It's a really dangerous way to play Kill Team, trying to just overload threats and see who can kill more stuff first. Sometimes it'll work out for you, and you'll blow out the enemy team. Sometimes you get blown out. I prefer not to bank on getting a bunch of charges on ready enemy operatives, or on just winning initiative rolls. Because I feel like it puts me in a better position to win games more reliably by controlling the board. I oftentimes end up staging my models not so that they can charge ready enemy operatives, but so that they can charge onto objectives or areas of the board where the enemy is going to have to go. Because of that, I often end up fighting against expended enemy operatives much of the time, and this ploy does very little. I very rarely use it, instead relying on Wraithbone Talisman to even out really bad dice, and trying to only engage in melee against enemy operatives that are already wounded, where I only need a hit or two to clean them up if I can help it at all. So the main times that I will use Ruthless Poise is like if I've won initiative and I'm in a position where I know I'm going to get like an important double fight. So using my Exarch or Warrior model with Blade Wind, I know that I can charge into multiple models that I need to kill, and I know I'm going to get some value out of it. Other than that, I tend not to use it at all. I'll only end up using it very occasionally, like one turning point of every couple games. Because I feel like the real value in the rerolls of this ploy are too easy for your opponent to deny by just activating their models that you can charge. Now, that brings us into our third conditional reroll strategic ploy, Khaine's Vengeance. Whenever a friendly Blades of Khaine operative is shooting an expended enemy operative, that friendly operative's ranged weapons have the ceaseless weapon rule. And in my opinion, and in the opinions of many of the successful Blades of Khaine players I've spoken with, this ploy is the engine that really makes the team run, especially into elites. I know that's going to sound kind of strange. Like Ruthless Poise, this gives you conditional access to ceaseless, but it only works on expended models instead of ready models, and it works on your shooting instead of your melee. And unless you're playing a really risky game, like we talked about in Ruthless Poise, or your opponent likes to run out into the open, it will often be easier for you to shoot at expended operatives than ready ones. Just your opponent's going to have to go on engage or move forward onto points, and so those will oftentimes be the models that are easiest to get a line on to shoot. Your opponent will, generally speaking, need to come closer to you in order to score points. And against elite teams that you outnumber, this is even more true. They simply don't have the activations to play keep away and avoid your ability to shoot them. But Milton, I hear you ask, why does ceaseless matter that much when most of our models just have shuriken weapons? Surely they aren't actually that good. Well, simply put, they are. I'm going to pull up some damage numbers for you. We'll talk about these a little bit. I'll go ahead and put the images on the screen. This is from the Kill Team damage calculator. Importantly, these numbers that I'm using here just include ceaseless. They do not include the potential access to lethal 5-up for Dire Avengers or Balanced. This is just the numbers on ceaseless and rending, so the profile for a baseline shot from a shuriken catapult or from a shuriken pistol, which all of our operatives have. So let's take a look at the math for Space Marines first. If we look at one round of shooting against Space Marines, the column on the left does not have ceaseless, and the column on the right does. We're looking at, without ceaseless, a shuriken weapon shooting at a Space Marine, dealing an average of 4.15 points of damage. Not great. With ceaseless, you're dealing an average of 6.07 points of damage. Still not incredible, but an important increase in damage. Where this really starts to matter, though, is if we look at 2 rounds of shooting into Space Marines. So, again, on the left, rerolls nothing. On the right, most common fail, so ceaseless. 2 rounds of shooting at Space Marines with shuriken weapons with no ceaseless, you're looking at 8.29 points of damage and a 17% chance to kill them. 2 rounds of shooting with ceaseless, and you're looking at an average damage of 12.14 and a 41.34% chance to kill, which is a massive increase in the amount of damage and your chance of killing enemy operatives, with, again, just baseline shuriken pistols with ceaseless. Now, if we look at 3 rounds of shooting at Space Marines, again, this is set up the exact same way. We're just increasing the number of rounds of shooting. 3 rounds of shooting Without Ceaseless, you're looking at an average damage of 12.44 with a 42.95% chance to kill. Basically the same as 2 rounds of shooting with Ceaseless. If we look at 3 rounds of shooting with Ceaseless, however, we're now dealing an average damage of 18.2 points of damage with a 77.94% chance to kill a Space Marine. This is huge. And, because Space Marines are generally considered one of the tougher matchups for Blades of Khaine right now, for most teams in the game, being able to be APL 3 and use even your normal warrior models to dash out of cover, shoot, and then move 7 inches back entirely out of line of sight, you can put really significant damage onto even the toughest models in the game without really offering them much of a trade. So it's really, really useful. Now, if we take a look at some other defensive profiles, let's see. If we're looking at sort of the guard equivalent, so humans, 7 wounds, 5 up saves. Without Ceaseless, a weapon is looking at 6.31 points of average damage with a 47.88% chance to kill. With Ceaseless, you're looking at an average damage of 8.55 with a 70% chance to kill. So a significant increase in your odds to kill guard equivalent models with a single shuriken shot, which is super important. And then if we're looking at 1 round of shooting versus the sort of standard elf profile of 8 wounds with a 4 up save, let's see, 1 round of shooting without Ceaseless, we're looking at 5.21 points of damage, 31.87% chance to kill. And with Ceaseless, we're looking at an average damage of 7.29 with a 49.68% chance to a kill. So again, a sizable increase in the average damage. And of course, average damage isn't everything, but it's important to consider just so that you have kind of a baseline understanding of what your models are most likely to be able to do. Against elf and human bodies, Khaine's Vengeance drastically changes your odds of getting kills. So you're much more likely not just to get a kill, but to be in scenarios where you can get double kills with a single model. So, charge, fight, and then shoot something else that's already activated. And those types of plays are where Blades of Khaine can really take off and put a game out of reach for the enemy. If you're trading 1 for 1, it's probably going to be rough. But if you can get a couple 2 for 1s, and get into a late game where your opponent's probably slower than you and maybe APL 2 to your 3, and you have more pieces on the table, you can really reliably win that type of game. But like I said earlier, just looking at the average damage numbers isn't the whole story. Obviously, these numbers are averages, and sometimes your shooting will do nothing. But especially when you're shooting with Dire Avengers with lethal 5 up, it isn't unusual to get 3 crits in a hit. Sometimes the Casino Cannon really works, and you get 4 crits and just kill a Space Marine with 1 shot from a random Aspect Warrior's pistol. And sure, technically, even a normal bolt pistol has a chance to roll 4 6s and do the exact same thing and the same amount of damage. But having Ceaseless and Rending makes it so much more likely to spike crit damage that is very hard to block. And I keep saying, when I'm talking to folks, that Blades of Khaine is actually a short-range shooting team that happens to be really good at finishing things off in melee. And this ploy is what makes that true. I often use it in turning points 2 and 3 of almost every game I play, in almost every matchup. And, like I said earlier, it's kind of the engine that makes the team work. If you're just charging into full health enemy models, it's probably going to be rough. If you can reliably soften those models up before you have to start charging, then things are really going to start firing for you. As an aside, a couple nights ago on Wednesday night, which is our normal Kill Team night, I was playing with a new player in town who's interested in Eldar. So I had just finished painting up my Plague Marines, so I played those, and he used my Blades of Khaine. And we sort of, talked through the game, talked through the decision making and some of the different ploys and techniques and how they work. Towards the late game, he had a Dire Avenger. He's like, I guess I'll pop up and shoot at your Plague Caster. And it was a scenario where it was a fairly close game. He had a couple different options, wasn't sure exactly what he should do, and just decided to just go ahead and take the shot. So his first shooting attack, uses the technique for lethal 5-up, gets ceaseless, and rolls. After his rerolls, 3 crits and a hit, flips the hit to a crit for rending. So it was putting 16 points of damage through at my Plague Caster. I didn't make saves. I made 2 of the damage reduction rolls, and he just one-shotted the Plague Caster from full health. And he seems pretty hooked on the team now, partly because of how good the random pistol shots felt with Ceaseless. He dealt a ton of damage just shooting random things with shuriken pistols, moving his Exarch up and double shooting shuriken pistols at my guys. It was really good, and that's oftentimes how I end up approaching the elite matchups myself. So, the final strategic ploy for Blades of Khaine is Dance of Death. Select 2 friendly Blades of Khaine operatives, visible to and within 6 inches of each other. Remove them both from the kill zone and set them back up in each other's previous locations. In other words, swap their positions. Now, when the new edition of Kill Team came out, this ploy was generally panned. Games Workshop had to give us something new because our old ploy, Eminent Grace, in the previous edition of Kill Team, gave us plus 1 inch of movement and the ability to move through friendly models. Well, now we've gone up from 6 to 7 inches of movement baseline, like all elves, and everyone can move through friendly models. So we had to get something new, and this is what they went with. Most of the online discussion I've seen about this ploy is people not really seeing very many uses for it and kind of forgetting about the fact that it exists. And initially I kind of felt the same way myself until I set myself the goal of forcing myself to use it at least once a game. It's for a tournament I went up to in Montreal. And in doing that, I started to really forcing myself to think about it, started to see plays that I hadn't previously seen. Now, I don't use it every game, but I do set up situations or small traps for my opponents regularly, and in my opinion, the biggest thing about Dance of Death is that we can essentially plan ahead and then use it in order to get maximum value out of a risky play at the end of a turning point, whether or not we win initiative in the following turning point. So usually, for me at least, this involves swapping a model's position with a striking scorpion that's using one with the gloom, or is hiding in a forward position in heavy cover. Some examples of what I frequently use this for. I really enjoy, if there is a shot that an opponent has offered up, at the end of a turning point, I'll go with a Dire Avenger or Dire Avenger Exarch, activating last, go up on top of a vantage point where they're exposed, and double shoot. Just try to put out as much damage as possible. And then in the following turning point, if I win initiative, I'll usually end up activating them first, shoot twice again if I've got targets, and then climb back down and get out of line of sight behind cover. But if I lose the initiative roll, I can then use Dance of Death to swap that model out with a Striking Scorpion using one with the Gloom, and put that Striking Scorpion up on a vantage point where it'll get light cover, and then it's got Super Conceal so they can't really shoot at it. Basically, I can use a Striking Scorpion that I've staged back out of line of sight where it can just see my model but not the enemy. I can use it to reel back that Dire Avenger or that Dire Avenger Exarch to complete safety if I happen to lose the initiative roll. Another good option is I'll frequently use my Striking Scorpions as far forward as I can, behind light cover, using one with the Gloom to stage them up to try and charge onto objectives. But with Dance of Death, you can do some interesting things, like having that forward Scorpion model with a nearby Howling Banshee who's a bit further back behind heavy cover. because then if you win initiative, you have the option to Dance of Death to replace that Scorpion with your Howling Banshee, who's now in a forward position to do an acrobatic charge. And this can be useful for a number of different reasons. It can give you the ability to put Howling Banshees really just about anywhere on the table if you want. But you can also use it as a telegraphed threat and measure out those threat ranges. So your opponent has to think like, okay, if I go up on top of any of these vantage points with my gunners, I'm going to catch a Howling Banshee to the face. And you can sometimes force people to play further back than they want to play, and not really threaten your models with their gunners in the way that they need to in order to effectively win the game. Another, a really effective use here is that you can hang a model out that you don't mind trading too much in a position where if you win initiative, you could potentially charge and double fight. And then if you win initiative, you can swap that model out for your Exarch, charge and double fight. If you do this with a Scorpion Exarch with a Claw, you can kill 2 8-wound models with almost zero counterplay, and then strike and fade back into cover and go on conceal. And that can be a huge swing in a game. And if your opponent's on the charge and not fight game plan where they want to go and hug models, you can use this to swap a model that's maybe injured and getting hugged for a fresh model nearby, ready to go on a killing spree. So the more you play and keep this ploy in mind, the more you'll see opportunities to use it. And while it won't come up all the time, it can create some moments that will really leave your opponent scratching their head and trying to figure out how they were supposed to avoid your Howling Banshees when they can just pop up anywhere on the board and then charge with acrobatic. Or how they're supposed to pin down your shooting threats when they can change places with an Exarch that eats your opponent's melee threats alive. So, that's all 8 of the ploys. I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. I know that's a lot of talking about sort of the strategy and how I like to play the team, and it's in a way that is maybe a little bit counter to a lot of the ways that folks tend to play Kill Team, focusing on eliminating ready enemy operatives if they if at all possible. But what Khaine's Vengeance allows us to do is really to kind of play super safe and still set these threats where any enemy models that move into the mid-board we can kill quite effectively, and then if the opponent has to keep exposing things in order to try and trade with us, we just go after those next. We'll talk about this some more as I start doing some videos talking about specific matchups, but I hope this has been useful. If you are interested in more Blades of Khaine content, I'm going to do a next video talking about equipment choices, highlighting some useful things on different maps, and then really going to start diving into specific matchups and specific board layouts, and talking about some of the tools that the team has, and really applying them in games instead of more of the rules-based content that we've talked about so far. So I hope that you find it useful. Thank you so much for listening to the channel and checking out what I'm doing here, and I hope you'll have a great time playing Blades of Khaine. See you again soon. Bye.